Thank you, and thank you for your attention on what I know has been an action-packed and an ideas-packed day. I also know it's a slightly dangerous part of the day. Everybody's flagging a bit, the caffeine's wearing off, the wine is getting ready downstairs. So I've borne all of that in mind. I've thought about you as my audience when I've been putting this together from being a delegate at many conferences like this. So thank you for your introduction, Helen. I'm originally from Manchester, and I now live and work in Sydney, and I've been in Australia for 8 years, 7 of which have been in Melbourne. The reason I've got those two images up there are because the Royal Exchange is an octagonal theatre, if you don't know it. As a kid, I used to go to the Royal Exchange, the football to see Man United, or the Halle Orchestra every Saturday afternoon. I thought that's what everybody did, because ultimately the processes were pretty similar. Mum and Dad arguing in the front, me and my sisters argue in the back. Where are we going to park the car where it won't get nicked? Nobody's going to nick the car, all that kind of stuff. So the processes were really simple. Are we going to get a cup of tea at half time? It became a shock to me when I hit 18 and realised that not everybody lived that life, that not everybody thought that sport, art and music had the same status. But it also became a shock. It was also a shock to me when I realised that not all theatres were octagonal. I remember having a bit of a row with the usher at a school trip to see something at the Palace Theatre, and it's a Victorian proscenium art theatre, and I kind of said, well, where are the seats down the side? And he said fairly imperiously, nobody sits round the side. And I said, I think they do. So, some would say that was bossy and precocious. Hopefully that was leadership potential. So I think the only reason I tell that story is because I think it's really important to think about your audience's perspective. We don't know that they may not have ever been to a theatre before. They don't know that if you sit further away from the stage, the tickets are cheaper. If you've never been to a bookies, do you know what to do? And if you don't, how scared do you feel? Because if you're a new member of the audience for any theatre company or museum or gallery, that's how you feel. So, and that's a cup of coffee because that features heavily in my life. Okay, so I'm doing these not in order because I wanted to be even more provocative. Relevant programming is more effective than marketing. Everybody at MHM and all of the people we work with work on the basis that we want to be artistically led and audience-centric. And it was extraordinary when I first heard that sentence, because I thought, for 5 years I ran Victorian Opera as managing director, and unwittingly I'd been doing that. Because Victorian Opera, and forgive me, just quickly, I don't come from opera land. Where I grew up, opera belonged to different people with different accents who lived on a different estate to me. So don't worry if you're kind of going, oh, it's opera. I'm just using this as a kind of case study. Victorian Opera is an extraordinary company that's been going 7 years in Victoria. Bizarrely, the market for opera in Melbourne is really competitive because the national company, Opera Australia, perform there, as do Victorian Opera, as do Melbourne Opera, and a number of other smaller companies. So we at Victorian Opera used to have lots of conversations that started with what makes our work distinctive. How will people know that it's a Victorian opera performance rather than any other opera company in the city? And I think as a way of starting a management team meeting, or a programming meeting, it's always a very, very good one. The other thing that happens is in Operaland is that people co-produce in order to share costs rather than to share an artistic intention. But delightfully, Victorian opera was very different to that. So this image is an image from a co-production that we did with Chunky Move, who are a Melbourne-based contemporary dance company. Those of you who know Gideon Osbarjanek, who used to run the company, he would always have one central idea for his work. So it might be light, or electronic music, or puppetry. So it would just be this one central idea, and then everything else kind of span out from that. Gideon wanted to do a piece of work that was only the human voice, only used the human voice, and no musical instruments at all. So unbeknownst to me, he met up with my music director. This happened a lot. They kind of had a meeting, and then the music director came in and said, "What do you think about co-producing with Chunky Move?" And it was a great idea, and we got Melbourne Festival and Sydney Festival and Melbourne Festival behind it. And it was a 90-minute show which really redefined what both art forms could be. The main thing is you have to, you do have to challenge your existing ways of working on an undertaking like a co-production. Gideon is somebody who doesn't really do schedules at all. My music director hadn't really woken up without a schedule in front of him for the best part of 40 years. So culturally, the two organisations had to work really, really hard to make sure that the co-production stayed on track. The most important part of this was workshopping all the stuff that could go wrong, workshopping what would happen if it didn't work, workshopping where the competitive behaviour could take place. Where the competitive behaviour could take place, workshopping things like sponsorship rights. And the only reason we were really, really rigorous about that piece of work and that co-production, which went beautifully, was because we'd had an experience the previous year where we'd co-produced with a partner and we hadn't had open and honest exchanges about why they wanted to work with us. After the show concluded, I said, "Why do you want to co-produce with us?" And they said, "Your budget and your donors." And I said, "Okay, had you said that at the beginning, that would have been great. We would have still co-produced, but that would have changed everything." So when we worked with Chunky Move, I said, "Why do you want to work with us?" And they said, "The central idea is brilliant. The central idea about the connection between human voice and breathing and dance and how we can use our bodies as a way of making music is brilliant." And so that experience of having a difficult conversation informed all the other conversations that were incredibly productive and progressive. I was saying to somebody earlier today, as a sector, I think we should have more difficult conversations. My experience of difficult conversations is they're not as difficult as you think they're going to be. That's something I think that we probably do quite a lot as consultants. But I was a practitioner 18 months ago, and I think that's something that you have to do when you lead an organisation, and it's something that you have to do when you're talking to donors and building a business case. So having those robust discussions is a fundamental part of who we are. It happens in the rehearsal rooms, it happens in museums and galleries at programming level, so we should make sure that it happens throughout the organisation. Be bold. If you're co-producing, you're doing things that you wouldn't normally do. You're doing things at a different time and in a different way. And I think that's been reflected back to me on a number of different sessions today in terms of when we were talking about social media, when I talked about, there are internal challenges that people need to get over, 6 people nodded really, really vigorously. So actually, our audiences may be way ahead of us and probably are way ahead of us in a number of different circumstances. And we just need to make sure that we internally keep pace with them. New spaces for digital engagement. For those of you who attended our session, this is the case study that I was talking about. I think this is the best example of a digital and an analog campaign being used to connect audiences with the organisation in the broadest possible way. So the Wheeler Centre is the centre for books, writing and ideas in Melbourne. Most of the events there are free. They have occasional events at Melbourne Town Hall which are paid for and ticketed. It's a place where writers and thinkers share their ideas in front of live audiences. It is all about talking. They would love this. Most of the work is recorded and podcast very quickly after the session takes place. I don't know whether you can see that, but the gentleman in the bottom left-hand corner is Nick Davis, who wrote the book Hacked Off and Journalism. He revealed the phone hacking scandal for The Guardian. Two along, Helen Garner and Hanny Rayson. Helen Garner, incredible writer, a literary non-fiction. So what happens is the audience figures for the Wheeler Centre are absolutely fantastic. It's free, it's got really intelligent, stranded programming, and actually it's artistically led and audience focused. So no matter what your issue is, the Wheeler Centre are covering it. So it's a really great place to talk. But the problem is they're not talking about the Wheeler Centre. They're talking about the ideas, they're talking about the stuff that happens there, but the overall kind of engagement in the brand was not necessarily as high as the organisation wanted it to be. They also wanted to increase the quality of the public discourse, which sounds lofty, but actually isn't that what we all want to do? I think we should be being lofty and ambitious in terms of the aims of our organisation. So what they wanted to do was create a campaign called Discuss. So over a period of 5 days, it was a real-time, social media-driven campaign, part caption contest, part street art project. We wanted to inspire the very opinionated Melburnians to take to Twitter to tell the world what they thought was worth discussing. And we then turned 100 of those discussions into permanent plaques throughout the city. So that sense that something exists in a social media network is very ephemeral and then disappears, actually disappeared. So this is some of the examples. There was great fun was had with this. So I don't know whether you can all read that, but that is a discussion marker that says, why can't we just let the boats in? What makes that even more appropriate is it's in front of the Department of Immigration. So it was placed there, with real care. How can we expect honesty from one another when we no longer expect it from our leaders? This is a bench in front of the state parliament. So we also had questions like, I want to boogie, and so on, but this is the gnarly stuff. Wikipedia makes us all subject matter experts, and the second image, why in a world full of phones does no one call to chat anymore? I didn't realize that until I read that question, and it's on the side of the Telstra building. So as you can see, there was big thinking, and it was really, really intelligently conceived. In total, just over 5,500 discussed tweets were generated, 2.4 million organic Twitter impressions, which is 13 times the normal Twitter engagement ratio. And it reached 62% of Melbourne's Twitter users. So the engagement, and that was a Wheeler Centre-led initiative. It wasn't to do with Germaine Greer's Keynote or any number of other authors. It was about elevating public discourse. It was also picked up by other media, in terms of the ABC, the traditional media, newspapers, which focused only on the Wheeler Centre and why they were doing it. I have to double-click this a few times, sorry, bear with me. So, for me, the reason that this is a terrific case study on a day like today and an afternoon like this afternoon is that the genesis of this was a problem, and the solution is actually an extension of who they are as an organisation. If other organisations in the city had done that, it absolutely would have been a gimmick. It would have been something that audiences wouldn't have engaged with in the same volume. But it was a natural extension of who they are as an organisation. As an organisation within the sector, everybody wants to work there. They're funded by an endowment from the Wheelers who published Lonely Planet. But they're in a position to be complacent if they wanted to be. Great audience figures, good funding, but actually for them, they are still hungry to elevate the public discourse, and they're still hungry to be creative and connect and be relevant to their community. And I think there is a lesson for that in all of us, for all of us. When I spoke to Michael Williams, the director of the Wheeler Centre, he told me it had taken him several years to get this idea off the ground. So, like all good ideas, they've got to cook for a bit, be patient, but just do it. One of their board members was a creative at one of the big advertising agencies in Melbourne and worked with them very closely with it. So I'm afraid I can take no credit for it other than being an active participant in asking lots of questions, not getting a marker, but that's fine. So that, for me, is a really compelling way of having a conversation with your audience. Learning to love infrequent attenders. I'm pinging back to Operaland very quickly, and I'm also pinging back to the UK to a campaign I worked on with my colleague Joe Taylor, who spookily now also works for MHM. It's really strange. Joe and I, when we worked for Welsh National Opera, we were performing in 15 different cities throughout the UK. There was a lot of opera going on, but there was a lot of opera that related to the top kind of 5 titles. So we were experiencing something known as repertoire fatigue. So everybody felt they'd seen Carmen, they'd all seen Tosca, all of that. So we had a discussion about going, okay, We really need to make sure that when people have seen Welsh National Opera, they know it's Welsh National Opera. We used to do doorstep mailings the following day. Did you enjoy the show? We didn't sell to them. It was just a thank you letter. Do you remember that when you were little, you used brought up to write thank you letters? It was a thank you letter. Thank you for coming to see our show. What we discovered we could do is produce, for 75p, tissues in one of the branded packs that said, "Did Welsh National Opera make you cry last night?" Which doorstepped the day after performances of Bohème. I've never got thank you letters for a campaign, but we got thank you letters for those. And so for me, the big learning about that is actually it's a competitive market. What do you need to do differently, and where do you need to invest? I'm sure if Joe was here, when Joe said, we just need to write them a thank you letter, I said, that's great. Whatever you do, don't let me try and sell them a ticket. She said, can I have that in writing? And when she came in with the letter initially, I said, shouldn't we put a PS saying we're coming back in 2 months? And you see, so it is about having that conversation with your audience. Finally, humans get humans. I was really inspired by the talk earlier. For me, we are all storytellers as arts organisations. We choose to tell the stories that we tell, but we need to think about our audiences when we do it. There can be fantastically creative solutions to problems, particularly in audience engagement and around behaviour. That point about whose audience do we want to connect to is really compelling. The MHM's Audience Atlas Victoria produced one of the biggest population surveys 18 months ago. The first appendix is the breakdown by organisation. We presented it in a similar way to the New Zealand Audience Atlas being presented here now. I then happened to have about 10 meetings in Melbourne following the presentation of that work. Almost everybody I met said, I haven't read the report. I went to the download by organisation, and then I Control F'd for my organisation, and I saw where our audiences went and where everybody else went. And they were all very, very shocked that their audiences attended the State Library and also attended the museum sector if they were performing arts organisations. The State Library and the museum, they were fine with that. So it's about thinking really laterally about your organisation. I also think that I have solved any number of audience engagement issues by having conversations with artistic directors, heads of music, directors, wardrobe people in their places of work and said, just explain to me why this work is significant to you. Explain to me what this really means. Because as an organisation, you pick up a verbal shorthand really, really quickly. And it's a lot to ask for your organisation to engage with that verbal shorthand too. But it can really solve problems. So for me, the session from Auckland Theatre Company about the different strands of audience engagement was truly has real impacts. The Girls' Night Out, a way of thinking about reaching groups of women and also getting them to engage with the organisation in a different way. The book club, something that I had been desperate to do at Welsh National Opera when we did a big Russian series, but we didn't get to it. The book club is a fantastic way of connecting people. Those networks already exist. It's just a question of making sure that you populate it with your information at the right time. Sunday afternoons. Belvoir in Sydney does a Q&A every Sunday afternoon for subscribers. Also on Mondays, on the first Monday of the month, Belvoir do a Q&A with Wesley Enoch, who is currently the Artistic Director of Queensland Theatre Company, about to join Sydney Festival as Director. And it's Wesley in conversation with another Indigenous person. And you don't know who that is until you rock up on the Monday. And I think if that's important to you, having those kinds of conversations about Indigenous art and the issues that provokes is a really, really fantastic, safe conversation. Wesley Enoch leads the conversation, so it's absolutely his narrative, and it's a really, really great way of connecting with a broader audience. And are there stories you're not telling? That, to me, just ping back to you as an organisation need to have difficult conversations. Have them so you can park them, so you don't have them on Twitter and Facebook, but just consider those conversations as well as the ones that you want to be bright and shiny and out there. The artistic director of Sydney Dance Company tweets about music that makes him cry when he walks along Bondi Beach. I don't find that profoundly shocking. I think that's a great, authentic and direct communication from somebody who is doing a version of what I'm doing on a Sunday. I think board and staff members were initially a bit kind of perplexed that that's what he would do, but it's what he would do if you bumped into him in a cafe. So again, it's just about the authenticity of it. And more clicks will get me to... There are more clicks. We're just clearly doing that slide twice because it's such good fun. The inevitable final slide. So really, I think that we've kind of all given you a number of takeaways anyway from the sessions, and I know your brains are full, but for me, the most important thing is to think about what makes your organisation distinctive. What do you do that nobody else does? Because in a competitive economy, if there's a replicated value, it's meaningless. If your organisation closed, how would your community be affected? I love asking this question to boards, because they all have the same facial expression, but over a period of time. So because they look outraged and they kind of go, actually, and then they go, we need to do more. So I think that's a really good question to ask in terms of if you can't answer it immediately with, and this isn't dollar value, this is the connections within your community. What stories are you telling and what do you want to tell? And the need to challenge ways of working. In the world that we're in, where there's an accelerated pace of change, where people are logging on and people are connecting, misspelling PowerPoint slides at the rate of knots, we need to keep pace with that. And you as an organisation can't be just you have to be flexible and you have to be able to kind of respond to that. Be positive. It's a great sector, producing great work. If I was still running Victorian Opera and able to co-produce, I don't think there's anybody in this room I wouldn't want to co-produce with. It's like there's great work and driven people and real passion. So, there's clearly great audience reach. If in New Zealand, if we're reaching 98% of the population, then that is meaningful in quite an interesting way. If you can't get your great idea over the line immediately, don't worry, be patient, but still get it over the line. Think long term. And then, after saying that, you all work very hard. Give yourself quick wins. It's just really, really important in terms of keeping the energy and the ideas up. The other thing for me about quick wins is it has to be cross-departmental. They don't necessarily sit in the marketing department. It's throughout the whole organisation. Thank you very much for listening so attentively. I don't know whether there's Q&As. I'll take I'll take Q's and A's, but if nobody's got any questions, that's also fine. Thank you.